Across the world, people have been watching the choice that Britain has made. I would reassure those markets and investors that Britain's economy is fundamentally strong. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
Britain has spoken, but the shockwaves will be felt throughout the world. While the United Kingdom's Parliament considers its next steps towards a Brexit, African economies are already starting to feel the brunt. As the biggest contributor to the European Union's development aid budget, much of which goes to Africa, Downing Street may be hoping to fall back on its trade relations with Commonwealth partners. But others say that the cost of Brexit is yet another reason for Africa to look east for economic support. So what can African governments do in the interim to mitigate the knock-on economic effects? And what will business be like in Africa after Brexit? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, after the historic Brexit vote, economists are warning that Britain's exit from the European Union could have widespread implications for the global economy over the next 3 years. Africa has strong trade ties with Europe, and just 2 weeks ago, a new partnership was signed between the European Union and several southern African countries. As CCTV Sumitra Naidu tells us, many are worried about this partnership going forward.
Britain joined the European Union in 1973. 2 years later, a referendum was held and favoured the UK staying in the EU. When the Eurozone, an economic and monetary union to coordinate economic policy, was launched in 1999, Britain chose to keep its own currency. Britain now wants to leave the euro area completely.
The key thing to understand is that it will be the British Parliament that announces to the European Union that it wants to take the country out of Europe. So that requires a solid majority in the British Parliament. This current Parliament was not elected on that ticket, so they will have to go to new elections. The only way to go to new elections is to have a no-confidence vote in the government. Now, given that the Prime Minister has resigned and it's not obvious who would take his place, it's possible they may get that no-confidence vote, but then they would have to go to a national election.
Global markets are in turmoil. For Africa, the worry is now over trade deals that may have to be renegotiated.
Until the exit package is agreed upon with the European Union, Britain will remain a member of the European Union. So it will be part of the common market until the exit button is actually pushed. The next question then is what replaces that? And we're talking a minimum of 3 years, I would say, before that button is actually pushed.
South Africa is Europe's largest trading partner in Africa.
For South Africa, though, it means that we would have to look to negotiate a separate trade deal with the UK. What that will do is it'll obviously stifle trade in the short term, and it depends on what trade deal we can get in place with the UK will determine how successful we are in accessing the UK market going forward.
Once Britain leaves the EU, it will no longer be part of the Eurozone and will lose preferential trade partnerships with the world's biggest free market. This could reduce the UK's appeal as an investment destination.
There are many companies in South Africa that have direct business links with the UK. There are many companies that have opened offices in the UK with implications of being able to move throughout Europe. They would have to relook at that and decide, do I relocate from the UK into mainland Europe in order to get better access to the European Union?
3 years is a long time to wait until Britain is settled as an independent player in the global economy. There's growing concerns that the UK could also suffer a recession. For South Africa, the timing couldn't be worse. Subdued growth from Europe will drag South Africa's already weak economy further into demise. Sumitra Naidu, CCTV, Johannesburg.
Now, while Article 50 is yet to be invoked by the British Parliament, the implications for the African continent are already hitting home. We spoke to citizens from across the continent to gauge their understanding of Brexit's impact.
Britain has not been so much helpful. Even look at the countries that they colonized. what they drop for them is corruption. If Germany leaves, then they'll be panicking. But for Britain, I don't think they are offering more.
The trade system, they might be affected too, because the free trade in some country may be the export and exporting can be affected in a way.
The fact is there's so many things which is connected via Britain. Then, for example, if we have to go and reach Britain, let's say I have to take the flight from here to Britain, all those costs that I used to pay, because Britain, there was a connection in between us. If Britain break out that connection, which means it's going to be more expensive for us to go to Britain. And there's a people who came from South Africa who stay there in Britain. There's a people from Britain who stay here in South Africa.
I think the idea that British want to exit from Europe is not going to affect Africa, particularly Ethiopia.
I don't think it will make much a difference. It's like yes and no, actually. Whether they exist or not, it doesn't have much effect on Ethiopia.
It might not be a wise idea for any country to consider pulling out of institutions like the EU, for example, because we are living in a global village, and I think we need each other, and they need the EU.
My family and many other Somali families rely on remittance sent from UK and Europe. My older brother is in the UK. Every month he sends us around $300. With the current pound renting, I don't think how he'll manage his costs as well as send us money in the coming months.
Largest foreign direct investment Nigeria has comes from Britain. So definitely what it portends for Nigeria is that there's going to be a drop in that foreign direct investment from Britain. So that's a negative impact for Nigeria.
Africa sells its products to the European Union. They have got to negotiate. Now they are going to negotiate differently with Britain, which is in the disadvantage of Britain. But when they negotiate with a group like the European Union, like the African, Caribbean and Pacific, they come in on the same terms, then the countries benefit. So this is going to have problems on Britain, because Britain will have to negotiate differently with different countries.
The shocks are there and they are felt everywhere, but I'm sure the situation will get calmer and things will sort of normalize, but the decision is fundamental, and they are already talking about having another referendum, because I think you have over 1 million people already with a petition to say, no, did we make the right decision? So let's watch the space and see.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guests will help chart the way forward for Africa after Brexit. Stay with us.
Africa is not one story.
Africa is not one story.
Let me be very open with you. I do not see any way of Britain taking back their decision to leave the EU. And we all would do ourselves a great favor if we would accept this as reality. This is not a time for wishful thinking, but a time of facing reality.
A time of facing reality. That was German Chancellor Angela Merkel speaking about Britain's Brexit decision. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to help chart the way for Africa after Brexit, I have expert guests standing by in London. Alex Vines, he's the head of the Africa program at Chatham House. In Washington, D.C., Dr. Ola Bello, he's the executive director at Good Governance Africa. He's based in Lagos. In Boston, Grieve Chelwa, he's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. And with me in Nairobi, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, he's the executive director for the Center for Policy Analysis here in Nairobi. Gentlemen, to you all, welcome to Talk Africa. Alex Vines in London, I'll start off with you. The world is still grappling with Britain's exit from the European Union. First, and very briefly, your reaction to the result of the referendum and the reaction in the aftermath.
Well, first of all, Britain hasn't exited the European Union. There's a referendum that is not legally binding. It's an advisory. So we still don't know whether Britain will exit the European Union or not, and we might not know for quite a few months yet. But my reaction to the referendum result was one of disappointment, but not entirely surprise. The deindustrialised parts of the United Kingdom, particularly in the northeast, in the Midlands and in parts of Wales, all voted to exit the EU. And that's to do with class and to do with inequality and to do with the lack of opportunity. So this was a protest vote and also a call for help. And I hope that certainly British politicians don't ignore that, but I think there are broader international lessons for Europe and beyond on the result that occurred through the referendum last week.
Dr. Olebello in Washington, D.C.
Well, I think, the vote is clearly a very disappointing outcome for many of us who were hoping that somehow we would be able to shift the debate on the UK's membership of the European Union in a much more positive, enlightened direction, if you want. Ultimately, I think the outcome represents an exercise in being counted, if you like, because there are legitimate concerns that voters have with regards to runaway uncontrolled immigration. But I think the beauty of the European Union transcends all of that. Let's not forget about it. This has been the longest period of peace in Europe after the World War II, and I think in many senses the European project has contributed to that. Now that's not a question you can put down to a yes or no answer. And I think some of those nuances got lost a bit, but like Alex, I hope that we can find a positive or a more inclusive solution and a way forward for everyone.
Right, Grieve Chelwa in Boston.
Well, I mean, to start with, as an economist, my first reaction was to sort of try to figure out the impact of the referendum result on, say, African economies, and precisely just to think whether this is going to have any serious impact, what the impact will look like. But like my other two colleagues have said, I think the big thing here is to figure out, as we try to integrate in Africa, what sort of lessons can we learn from sort of Britain's relationship with the European Union.
Ambassador Mbai.
Well, I found it unexpected, disappointing, but I think a little bit in keeping with the British tradition of opt-out options within the EU. It looks like Britain has not grasped the meaning of globalization, and I suspect it is going to hit them quite hard, and there is a bit of rethinking. That's why they cannot invoke Article 50 yet, because as Alex said, it's an advisory referendum, and who knows, they could change their mind about it. I think there is quite a bit to lose by Britain if they move out, yes.
So, Alex Vines, the three issues here that have come out, the issue of inequality, the issue of integration, and the issue of the economic impact here. Let's start off with that whole question of immigration that was topping the debate there in the run-up to the referendum. What's the post-immigration, the immigration issue going to look like now after this referendum vote?
Yeah, immigration was one of the drivers for the vote to exit the EU. There's undoubtedly that's the question, and it's more openly discussed now in the UK than it has been for a long time. But this, let's be clear, this is not about African immigration. This is about immigration, migrancy from members of the European Union. That's where the biggest fear was played. It's about Poles, Lithuanians, Estonians, and other members of the European Union getting jobs and making lives in the United Kingdom. And it was particularly hard felt in the marginalised, deindustrialised parts of the UK, where competition for jobs and opportunities are so intense. Britain's going to find it very difficult, I think, if it wants to remain with free and unfettered access to the common economic area of the EU, so the common market, if it wants to put barriers up on European migration and the movement of people and goods. So I think some of the promises that have been made in this Brexit campaign by the Leave campaign, that they would be able to control European Union migration into the EU, is going to be very difficult to actually implement. And so, again, I think this is one of the reasons why this whole thing will probably need to be politically rethought in London.
Griff Chelwa, though, that's mentioned. Griff Chelwa, to you, though, Alex does mention that it is actually about immigration from other European Union countries, but there are increasing numbers of African immigrants coming in through North Africa. What's your take?
First of all, I'm not a migration expert, but I think I'll take Alex's word for it. My reading is precisely what he said, that is really much a debate about immigrants from the rest of Europe competing for jobs in Britain. And I think over the last decades, Britain has deindustrialized, and then jobs, probably there are more jobs in the services sector, and those jobs require people who are sort of highly skilled. And if there's a skills mismatch, or probably your education system is not producing enough skills, then you have a feeling of discontent. So in some ways, I sort of echo Alex's take on this.
Dr. Olebello?
Well, my sense is that, the whole debate about the uncontrolled immigration or badly managed immigration in the UK, and the way that the average citizen somewhat holds the European Union responsible for this unwelcome state of affairs is actually representative of the way that the larger debate on Britain's membership of the European Union has played out. There are a lot of nuances in this debate which I think has first been difficult to convey to ordinary voters, but also politicians on both sides of this debate, in the way we've seen it played out, sometime played very loose with the fact, and I think that has not helped in terms of the ultimate outcome.
All right, Dr. Ambassador Mbaya.
I want to agree with Alex on the question of immigration, but I think the immediate trigger of sentiments and emotions is really the number of refugees and who are coming from Middle East and also from Africa. And to a certain extent, Britain is responsible for the destruction of stability in Libya, and that's why Libya itself cannot control migrants wanting to move to Europe. So it's a combination of factors, and whether we want to focus on European migration alone, I don't think is enough. We need to take it in context in terms of the overall immigration factors that are coming from outside Europe itself.
Right. Dr. Griff Chelwa, though, the whole question of integration and economic integration in particular, because African countries have been pushing towards enhancing their regional economic communities, and they've been looking at deeper integration, economic, political, as the way forward. What are we learning, though, from the European Union regarding that?
The thing is, economic integration is incredibly desirable. If you think about Africa, right, there's very little intra-African trade that currently takes place. And this is a pity because the African market is about 1 billion people strong, and that's like a really big market that African countries can tap into. So it would be really nice if we could integrate economically, sell lots of goods and services to each other. But at the same time, I think what we learn from Britain's experience is that we should also not forget about the less of our people, right? So in Britain's case, the discontent, like Alex has said, is coming from people who feel left out, right? I mean, it's really a truism that integrating, in some ways, trade makes everyone on net better off, but there are some losers, and as we integrate, we have to always think about the losers. So if for instance, Zambia starts selling lots of products that Nigeria used to make, and we start selling those products to Nigeria, what is the Nigerian government doing about workers who lose jobs precisely because of that? So I think we have to have a very careful and balanced approach, and thinking about everybody in terms of integration.
Alex Vine.
Well, look, this is going to be a particularly difficult issue for the United Kingdom government, given that they've just had a referendum about withdrawing from a regional community, the European Union. One of the planks of British policy has been to institution build and support regional economic communities, the African Union. I'm not sure how the British government is going to reframe that narrative now of what was one of the planks of British foreign policy, one of their kind of pillars. It's going to be interesting to see how that develops. My own view is that we need more integration with globalization. We are more interconnected. And so I do find that what the referendum result here, although I understand it, I feel it's counterintuitive to the global forces of globalization that we're facing. My worry about this is that I don't think the United Kingdom is unique in this experience. My biggest single worry that as a lesson out of this referendum is that I think it enhances the chance of, for example, a Trump presidency in the United States. The drivers in the United States are not dissimilar. If you look at the Rust Belt in the Midwest and the drivers of people there moving towards supporting Trump.
Right.
So I think the UK should be a warning for the United States as it moves towards an election.
Ambassador Mbaya, of course, to you that question as well, but I do also want to get a feel of what exact impact, though, is this referendum going to have in terms of the geopolitical relations for Britain and Africa, in terms of probably the political realities now?
On paper, it shouldn't have any impact, but politics is not about paper. Politics is about realities. And the realities are that if Britain moves out of the European Union, it's going to be a much weaker Britain. And therefore, its economic influence internationally will be so diminished. I want to believe that the referendum was probably one on local issues, like Alex said, in terms of the inequalities between the poorest parts of Britain and the richer parts. But when it comes to policy towards Africa, for instance, Britain is going to have less influence than it has within the European community, because she's not United States, not China, not India, and so Britain's voice will be much more diminished than it has been within the European Union. I agree with Alex. I don't know what policy they're going to pursue, and I think to be a whole realization and probably re-examination of British foreign policy towards developing countries in general.
Let's get your view, gentlemen, there to all of you. Are we going to see now, though, a less influential Britain when it comes to dealing with matters in Africa? Are we going to see a much weaker Britain, though, now that it is no longer part of the European Union? First, Alex Vine, to you.
Look, I think that you'll see the UK priority. If the UK ends up outside the EU, we'll see some African countries becoming even more important and greater priorities for the United Kingdom's foreign policy. So if you're in Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa in particular, I think you'll see even further deepening and more British resources and attention. My biggest worry in the short term of this referendum result is actually the liquidity issues that we're seeing globally, especially for the currency fluctuations across the continent. So, you know, the currency fluctuations, especially related to the price of the dollar, this is going to hit countries with high debt in particular. So if you're Ghana or South Africa, or Mozambique, or certainly Zimbabwe, which has an acute liquidity crisis and there's already a run on the dollar, this is a really bad situation for you, and it's going to play out for a number of years. And so I can see some real hammering of indebted countries where the debt to GDP ratio is very high.
Right. Dr. Griff Chelwa.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to agree with both speakers in saying that a Britain outside of the European Union is a very weak Britain with respect to Africa. I mean, it's, for instance, total exports to Britain from Africa are only 5% of Africa's total exports. Our biggest, like some of the colleagues have already said there, our biggest sort of partners are China, the European Union, the United States in terms of trade. So Britain outside the EU is a very diminished Britain. Britain on its own in terms of global GDP is between 2% and 5%, so it's very sort of tiny in relative terms. Now, thinking about sort of the economic impact in terms of what Alex has said, I mean, I agree with him to an extent, but not so much. What we are seeing now is that the markets are already stabilizing, and I think what happened was that the markets were caught a bit unawares by what happened on Thursday. And now we see the market stabilizing. Of course, the pound has been sort of collapsing, But I don't expect this sort of stability or volatility to continue into the foreseeable future. Calm is getting into the markets. The financial experts are beginning to realize that, okay, a little bit of the uncertainty is being resolved as the days go by. So I don't expect a really big economic impact, unless maybe for the rand. I see the rand is quite volatile, and that's precisely because a lot of companies are joint listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange, and then there's a very big foreign direct investment component from Britain into South African banks, for instance.
Right.
But otherwise, it should be plain sailing from now on, yes.
Dr. Olabello, though, as we talk about a more diminished Britain now outside of the European Union, do you think that this would probably make China a more attractive economic partner now to Africa?
Well, my hope certainly is that all of these partners can be attractive in Africa, and that we Africans can relate to them economically and otherwise in ways that are ultimately beneficial for development on our continent. There is no escaping from the fact Britain is an attractive hub for many international businesses as a gateway to the European Union. I think is that much more diminished when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, and as it seems quite likely now. But I think there are also opportunities that players in Africa can explore pragmatically. Alex mentioned Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and the rest of them may be becoming more attractive for the European, for the United Kingdom. I think it caught the other way as well. If you look at what the Buhari administration has been trying to do in Nigeria, a country with huge agricultural potential, frittered away a lot of the petrodollar that were earned in the boom years.
Right.
Now Nigeria needs to return to agriculture big time, and I think a market like the UK might just provide that sort of outlet they've been seeking with the European Union, which has really not materialized over the past few years.
Ambassador Mbai, you have the final word.
Let me say this. One, as I came to the studio, there were reports that important companies, including British companies, were moving out, or considering moving out of London into the European Union to create their headquarters there. It means shifting financial services from London will weaken the British economy. It will make it smaller. Therefore, what Alex is suggesting may not even happen, because Britain will not have the money to finance all those aggressive foreign policies in Africa. The second thing is that the referendum is likely to tear Britain itself, the United Kingdom itself, into pieces. Scotland have expressed anger at the results, so has Northern Ireland. And I think if you have a disintegrating United Kingdom, it is going to play very little role internationally, and therefore diminished position by Britain is a very likely event to come from out of this Brexit.
All right, and gentlemen, thank you very much. That's all we have time for this weekend. Thank you to my guests for your insights. In London, Alex Vines, he's the head of the Africa program at Chatham House. In Washington, D.C., Dr. Olabello, he's the executive director at Good Governance Africa based in Lagos. He's joining us today from Washington, D.C. In Boston, Grieve Echelwa, he's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. And with me here in Nairobi, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, he's the executive director for the Center for Policy Analysis. Thank you very much for joining us. And remember to join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.